The void trembled as something massive tore through hyperspace, ripping reality apart like paper. Stars flickered and dimmed as Kethra emerged from the dimensional rift, its crystalline hide catching starlight like 1,000 predator eyes. The creature was enormous, bigger than anything humanity had ever built. Its body stretched longer than 3 coalition destroyers welded end to end, a living nightmare of biomechanical horror that defied every law of nature. Admiral Lee Taman gripped the armrest of his command chair aboard the Harmony's edge, watching the monster approach through the main viewport. His knuckles were white, but his voice remained steady when he spoke. All ships maintain formation. Do not break ranks under any circumstances. The bridge crew moved with practiced efficiency, but Taman could see the terror in their eyes. Every person in the fleet had heard the stories. The tales of entire armadas driven insane by Kethra's psychic screams. The reports of worlds stripped bare, their populations either dead or mad. The creature had been killing for 300 years, and it had never once been defeated. "We're receiving distress signals from the outer colonies," reported communications. Officer Kim Sujin, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "New Sol is requesting immediate evacuation assistance. They're saying the creature will reach them in less than 6 hours. Taman nodded grimly. New Sol housed 12 million? Civilians, men, women, children, who had no way to defend themselves against what was coming. The Coalition had assembled the largest fleet in human history to stop this thing. But looking at it now, their ships seemed like toys. Kethra moved through space with impossible grace, its massive form undulating like a sea creature swimming. Through an ocean of stars, dozens of tentacles, each one thick as a starship's hull, writhed around its body in hypnotic patterns. The creature's hide wasn't just crystalline, it was alive, pulsing with veins of blue-green light that ran across. Its surface like electric rivers. Tactical analysis. Lieutenant Park Dahan, Taman ordered. Never taking his eyes off the approaching nightmare, Park Dahan's fingers danced across her console, pulling up holographic displays that showed the creature's specifications. She found made her stomach turn. Sir, the beast is approximately 4 kilometers long and 2 kilometers wide. Its bioarmor appears to be a form of living crystal that can regenerate damage. Energy signatures suggest it's powered by some kind of quantum fusion process we don't understand. Weapons? Were unknown, sir? But based on previous encounters, it can project devastating psychic attacks, and its tentacles are strong enough to crush a battleship's hull. Taman had read every report, studied every recorded battle. The Zephyrian Empire had created Kethora as their ultimate weapon during the Great War, using forbidden bioengineering techniques that turned a living creature into an instrument of pure destruction. When the Zephyrians fell, most of their war machines died with them. But Kethra had survived, roaming the galaxy like a mad god, destroying everything in its path. Sir, it's changing course, called out Navigator Yoon Ji-ho. It's heading directly for us. The creature had noticed them. Its massive head, crowned with horn-like projections that sparked with electrical energy, turned toward the human fleet. Even at this distance, Taman could feel something pressing against his mind, a cold, alien presence that made his teeth ache. All ships, battle stations, he commanded. Prepare for combat. The Coalition fleet spread out in attack formation. 57 ships in total, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels. Each one represented the pinnacle of human military technology, crewed by the bravest men and women the species had to offer. It should have been enough to stop anything, but as Kethra drew closer, Taman realized they were about to face something that existed beyond the normal rules of war. The creature's tentacles began to glow brighter, and suddenly the space around it filled with smaller biomechanical forms, living missiles that detached from its body and streaked toward the human fleet. They moved with predatory intelligence, weaving between defensive fire and striking with surgical precision. Incoming projectiles, shouted Park Dahan, point defense systems engaging. The fleet's automated guns came alive, filling space with streams of laser fire and explosive rounds. Several of the biomissiles were destroyed, but others adapted, their forms shifting to become harder to target. When they struck, They didn't just explode, they burrowed into the ship's hulls like parasites, eating through armor and systems. With terrifying efficiency, Stellar Wind is reporting massive hull breaches, Kim Soo-jin called out. They're requesting immediate assistance. But there was no time to help. Kethra was almost upon them now, its massive form blotting out the stars. Up close, the creature was even more terrifying than the report suggested. Its hide wasn't just crystalline, it was covered in complex patterns that seemed to shift and change as they watched. Organic weapon ports opened along its flanks, revealing rows of biocannons that pulsed with deadly energy. Firing solution. Locked, Park Da-hyen reported, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. All ships report ready to fire. Timon took a deep breath. This was it, humanity's last stand against a monster that had terrorized the galaxy for 3 centuries. Fire everything we have. The human fleet unleashed hell. Plasma cannons screamed across the void, their brilliant beams painting space in shades of blue and white. Fusion missiles streaked toward their target, each one carrying enough destructive power to level a city. Particle beam weapons carved brilliant lines through the darkness, and railguns hurled projectiles at a significant fraction of light speed. The barrage was magnificent and terrible, a display of human ingenuity and determination that lit up the void like a second sun. For a moment, Taman allowed himself to hope that their combined firepower might be enough. Then Kethra's hide began to glow. The creature's crystalline armor absorbed the incoming fire like a sponge soaking up water. Plasma beams that could melt through a meter of steel simply disappeared into its surface. Missiles that should have torn it apart barely left scratches. Even the devastating particle beams seemed to do nothing more than make its bioluminescent patterns pulse brighter. No effect, Park Da-hyen reported, her voice hollow with disbelief. All weapons ineffective. Kethra's response was swift and merciless. The creature's horn-like projections suddenly blazed with energy, and a wave of pure psychic force erupted. From its massive form, the attack wasn't physical, it was something far worse. It reached into the minds of every human in the fleet, filling their thoughts with terror and despair. On the bridge of the Harmony's edge, trained officers began to scream. Some collapsed, clutching their heads as alien thoughts invaded their minds. Others simply stared into space, their eyes blank and lifeless. The creature's psychic assault was turning the fleet's greatest strength, their humanity, into a weakness. All ships maintained discipline, Taman shouted, fighting against the waves of terror that threatened to overwhelm his own mind. Do not let it break you. But it was too late. Throughout the fleet, crews were abandoning their posts, else some ships began firing randomly, their gunners driven mad by visions of impossible horrors. Others simply drifted, their crews catatonic. Or worse, then Kethra's tentacles struck. The massive appendages moved with impossible speed, each one striking with the force of a falling mountain. The cruiser Dawn's Promise was caught by 3 tentacles at once, its hull crumpling like paper as the creature's grip tightened. The destroyer Valiant Heart tried to escape, but another tentacle wrapped around its engine section and simply tore it away. In minutes, half the fleet was gone. Ships that had taken years to build and represented the hopes of billions were reduced to floating debris. The survivors scattered, their formations broken, their crews struggling to maintain any semblance of order. Tae-min watched the slaughter with growing horror. They had brought everything they had, and it wasn't enough. Nothing they did seemed to even slow the creature down. It moved among their ships like a predator among prey, its tentacles striking with casual efficiency. Sir Park Da-hyen called out, her voice barely audible over the chaos. The creature is positioning itself for another attack. We need to retreat. But Taman couldn't retreat, not with 12 million civilians depending on them. Not when this might be humanity's last chance to stop the monster that had haunted the galaxy for 3 centuries. All remaining ships, form. Up on me, he commanded. We're going to ram it. It was suicide, but it was the only option left. If they could damage the creature enough, maybe slow it down, the colonies might have time to evacuate. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all they had. The surviving ships moved into position, their engines burning bright as they prepared for one final desperate charge. Taman could see the determination in his crew's faces, the same resolve that had carried humanity to the stars. They would not go quietly into the night, but just as they began their attack run, something impossible happened. Kethra stopped. The creature hung motionless in space, its massive form suddenly still. The bioluminescent patterns on its hide shifted from aggressive red to something softer, almost confused. For a long moment, it simply floated there, as if listening to something only it could hear. Then, without warning, it turned and fled. The creature that had never retreated from any battle, that had destroyed entire civilizations without hesitation, simply vanished into hyperspace. It left behind only wreckage and bewildered survivors, and the haunting question of what force could make the galaxies most feared weapon turn away from an easy victory. Tay-Min stared at the empty space where Kethra had been, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Around him, the surviving crew began to cheer, but he felt no joy. Something had changed, something fundamental about the nature of their enemy, and somehow, that terrified him more than the battle itself. 3 days after the battle that shook, the galaxy Cathora drifted through the empty darkness of the Kepler 442 system like a wounded giant. The creature's massive form, once pristine and terrifying, now bore the scars of centuries. Deep gouges ran across its crystalline hide where ancient weapons had found their mark. Strange fluids leaked from cracks in its bioarmor, creating trails of luminescent mist that sparkled in the starlight. For the first time in 300 years, the galaxy's most feared weapon was exhausted. The creature's biosystems, engineered by the long-dead Zephorians to be nearly immortal, were finally showing signs of failure. Internal organs that had never needed rest were shutting down one by one. The quantum fusion processes that powered its massive form were flickering like dying stars. Even its psychic abilities, once strong enough to drive entire fleets insane, had dimmed to barely a whisper. Kethra needed something it had never required before: sanctuary. The creature's remaining senses scanned the system, searching for somewhere safe to rest. Most of the planets were barren rocks or gas giants, useless for its needs. But one world called to it, a small blue-green planet that radiated the warmth of life. Haven's Rest hung in the void like a precious jewel, its surface covered in vast oceans and green continents. It had been a thriving agricultural colony until the evacuation orders came. Most of the colonists had fled when news of Kethra's approach reached them. But a few stubborn souls had chosen to stay behind. Dr. Kim Haijin stood in the observatory of the research station, coffee growing cold in her hands as she watched the approaching nightmare. The station's automated defense systems had been offline for weeks. Not that they would have made any difference against something like Kethra. All they could do was watch and wait. "Mama, something's wrong with the scary thing," said Sora, her 8-year-old daughter, pressing her small hands against the reinforced glass of the viewport. The child had been born mute, unable to speak a single word, but her dark eyes held an intelligence that often startled adults. She communicated through gestures and expressions, and right now, her face showed concern rather than fear. Haijin knelt beside her daughter, following her gaze to the approaching creature. Even at this distance, Kethra was massive, a living mountain of biomechanical horror that defied every law of nature. But something was different about it. The creature's movements were sluggish, almost clumsy. Its bioluminescent patterns, usually bright and aggressive, flickered weakly like dying fireflies. "I think you're right, sweetheart," Haijin whispered. "It does look hurt." The creature entered the planet's atmosphere with none of its usual grace, instead of the controlled descent that had been reported in other worlds. Kethra fell like a meteor, its massive form trailing fire and smoke. The planet's early warning systems screamed alerts that no one was left to hear, and the few remaining colonists braced themselves for impact. When Kethra struck the surface, 20 kilometers from the research station, the ground shook like an earthquake. Trees for miles around were flattened by the shockwave, and a pillar of dust and debris shot into the sky like a volcanic eruption. The research station's windows rattled in their frames, and emergency lights flickered throughout the facility. but there were no secondary explosions. No energy discharges that turned sand into glass. No psychic screams that drove people mad. Just the sound of something massive and tired coming to rest. Jin grabbed her emergency scanner and rushed to the station's long-range sensors. What she found made her gasp in amazement. The creature's bio readings were unlike anything in the historical records. Its energy output had dropped to barely 10% of normal levels. Its neural activity was minimal, almost dormant. Most shocking of all, its aggressive pheromone markers, the chemical signals that had driven entire populations to panic, were completely absent. "It's not dead," she announced to the other colonists who had gathered in the station's common area. Their faces were tight with fear and uncertainty, but they listened as she explained her findings. "But it's not fully alive either. It's like like it's in some kind of stasis." Old farmer Yang Dongsu, his weathered hand still shaking from the impact, shook his head vigorously. "I don't care what it's doing. We need to contact the coalition immediately. Tell them where it is before it wakes up and kills us all." Engineer Choi Minho, who had been working on the station's communications array, nodded in agreement. "Yang's right. We should evacuate while we still can. My transport shuttle has enough fuel to reach the nearest coalition outpost." But Dr. Park Ji-woo, the station's chief biologist, looked thoughtful.
Wait a minute.
"In all the reports, Cathra has never shown signs of fatigue or damage. It's supposed to be virtually immortal. If it's in stasis, there must be a reason." Jin pulled up the sensor data on the main display, highlighting the unusual readings. "Look at this. The creature's biopatterns are completely different from what we've seen before. It's not just resting, it's healing. Those scars on its hide, the fluid leaks, the power fluctuations, they're all signs of damage that's been accumulating for centuries." "Are you saying it's been hurt all this time?" asked Minho, his engineer's mind intrigued despite his fear. "I'm saying it's been dying," Jin replied quietly. "Slowly, gradually, but dying nonetheless. And now it's finally reached the point where it needs to rest or it will shut down completely." As if drawn by her words, Sora tugged at her mother's sleeve and pointed toward the crater. In the growing twilight, a faint blue glow emanated from Kethra's massive form, pulsing slowly like a heartbeat. The light was soft and gentle, nothing like the harsh glare of its weapons or the menacing patterns they had seen in the battle recordings. The child's expression was not one of fear, but of profound sadness, as if she could sense something that adults could not. She placed her small hand on the glass and tilted her head, as if listening to a sound only she could hear. "What is it, sweetheart?" Jin asked, kneeling beside her daughter. Sora couldn't answer with words, but her gestures were clear. She pointed to the creature, then to her own chest, and finally made a motion like something breaking. The meaning was unmistakable. She sensed that Kethra was in pain. The other colonists continued their debate, some arguing for evacuation, others for contacting the coalition. But Jin found herself studying the creature through the station's telescopes. Watching the slow rise and fall of its massive form, steam rose from its crystalline hide, where its internal heat met the cool evening air, creating ghostly patterns in the mist. As the hours passed, something extraordinary happened. The local wildlife, which should have fled in terror from the galaxy's most feared predator, began to return. First came the insects, drawn by the warmth radiating from the creature's body. Then small mammals emerged from their hiding places, sniffing cautiously at the air. Even the birds, which had been silent since the impact, began to sing again. It was as if the planet itself could sense that this was not the same monster that had terrorized the galaxy for 3 centuries. This was something else, something, wounded and vulnerable, seeking only peace. Dr. Park Ji-woo made the first tentative approach to the crater's edge, his bioscanner held out before him like a shield. What he found there challenged everything they thought they knew about Kethra. The creature's psychic emanations, once strong enough to drive people insane, were now barely detectable. Instead of the aggressive mental projections that had been reported, there was something else, a deep, overwhelming sadness that seemed to seep from the creature's very being. "It's not just physically exhausted," he reported back to the station. "It's emotionally drained. Whatever drove it to destroy for 3 centuries, it's gone." All I can sense now is loneliness. As night fell over Haven's Rest, the colonists made their decision. They would stay and observe, at least for now. The creature showed no signs of aggression, and its condition seemed to be stabilizing. Most importantly, Sara refused to leave the viewport. Her small hand pressed against the glass as she maintained her silent vigil over the sleeping giant in the crater. Kethra's massive form pulsed with that gentle blue light, its bioluminescent patterns shifting like slow-moving constellations. For the first time in 3 centuries, the galaxy's most feared weapon was truly at rest, and somehow, the small agricultural world of Haven's Rest had become the sanctuary it had been searching for. Against all logic and her mother's frantic protests, Sora began visiting the crater each day. The 8-year-old would slip away from the research station at dawn, her small backpack filled with drawing supplies and a thermos of juice. She would sit at the edge of the massive impact site, drawing pictures in the dirt with a stick while the towering form of Kethra pulsed with that strange blue light just meters away. "Sara, you can't keep doing this," Dr. Kim Haijin pleaded, chasing after her daughter for the 3rd time that week. "It's dangerous. We don't know what that thing might do if it wakes up." But Sora simply shook her head and pointed to the creature. With determination in her dark eyes, she made gestures that her mother had learned to interpret over the years. The creature was sad. It was hurt, and it needed someone to sit with it. To the little girl, it was as simple as that. Haijin watched. From what she considered a safe distance, her portable scanner recording everything. The readings she collected defied every principle of xenobiology she had ever studied. When Sora was near the creature, Kethra's biopatterns changed dramatically. The stress indicators that had been spiking since its crash dropped to almost peaceful levels. Its neural activity, usually a chaotic storm of aggressive signals, settled into something that resembled curiosity. "This is impossible," Haijin muttered to herself, reviewing the data for the 100th time. "It's like she's communicating with it somehow." The other colonists thought she was crazy for allowing her daughter near the creature. Old farmer Young Dong-Su had stopped speaking to her entirely, convinced that she was putting everyone at risk. Engineer Choi Min-ho had offered to forcibly restrain Sora if necessary. Even Dr. Park Ji-woo, who had been fascinated by the creature's behavior, warned that they were playing with forces beyond their understanding. But the data didn't lie. When Sora was present, Kethra's bio readings were more stable than they had been since the crash. Its healing processes seemed to accelerate, and the dangerous energy fluctuations that had worried them all practically disappeared. Most remarkably, the creature's psychic emanations, which had been a source of constant low-level anxiety for everyone on the planet, became almost soothing when the child was nearby. Determined to understand what was happening, Haijin threw herself into research with an intensity that surprised even her. She accessed every database she could find, pulling up classified files about the Zephyrian Empire that had been sealed for decades. What she discovered painted a picture of horror that made her stomach turn. The Zephyrians had been master bioengineers, capable of reshaping life itself to serve their purposes. During the Great War, they had created thousands of living weapons, each one more terrible than the last. But Kethra had been their masterpiece, not just a weapon, but a living symbol of their power. The creature hadn't been born a monster. According to the fragmented records, it had originally been something called a harmony singer, a peaceful, telepathic being that the Zephyrians had discovered on a distant world. These creatures were naturally empathic, able to sense and soothe the emotions of other life forms. They were shepherds of their world's ecosystem, maintaining balance through their psychic abilities. But the Zephyrians had seen a different use for such gifts. They had captured the largest and most powerful of these beings and subjected it to centuries of genetic manipulation, psychological conditioning, and neural implants. They had taken a creature designed to bring peace and twisted it into an instrument of war. The process had been horrific, layer by layer. They had built new programming over the creature's original nature. Combat instincts were grafted onto its peaceful mind. Weapons were grown from its body. Its empathic abilities were perverted into tools of terror. By the time they were finished, nothing remained of the original being except buried memories and suppressed instincts. The breakthrough came when Hyjin discovered references to something called the Silence Protocol, a fail-safe built into Kethra's conditioning that could override its programming. The Zephyrians had been paranoid about their creations turning against them, so they had installed kill switches in all their bioweapons. But the command word for Kethra's protocol had been lost when the Zephyrian Empire collapsed, taking its secrets to the grave. Meanwhile, Sora continued her daily vigils, oblivious to the scientific drama unfolding around her. She would sit cross-legged in the dust at the crater's edge, sometimes for hours, her young face peaceful as she gazed at the towering creature. She would draw pictures in the dirt, simple images of flowers, animals, and people holding hands. Sometimes she would hum softly, wordless melodies that seemed to make the creatures bioluminescent patterns, pulse in rhythm with her voice. The most remarkable moments came when Sora would place her small hand on pieces of debris from Kethra's crash. The fragments of crystalline bioarmor were still warm to the touch, and when the child made contact with them, she would close her eyes and tilt her head as if listening to something only she could hear. During these moments, the entire body would seem to relax, its massive form settling deeper into the crater like a cat finding a comfortable spot to sleep. Dr. Park Ji-woo, who had been monitoring the creature's psychic emanations, reported something extraordinary during one of these sessions. "The neural patterns are incredible," he told Hyjin. "When your daughter touches those fragments, Kethra's brain activity shifts completely. It's as if the creature is remembering something peaceful and beautiful." The other colonists remained skeptical, but they couldn't argue with the results. The creature showed no signs of aggression, and its condition continued to improve. The dangerous energy leaks that had worried them all had sealed themselves. The creature's biosystems were stabilizing. Its psychic emanations had become so gentle that even the local wildlife had begun to return to the area. One evening, as Hyjin watched through her telescope, she saw something that made her heart skip a beat. One of Kethra's massive tentacles, which had been motionless since the crash, shifted slightly, not in threat or aggression, but in what almost looked like recognition. The appendage, thicker than a tree trunk and covered in crystalline scales, moved with careful deliberation toward where Sora sat. Hyjin grabbed her communicator, ready to call for an emergency evacuation. But what happened next stopped her cold. The tentacle came to rest just a few meters from Sora, close enough that the child could see her reflection in its crystalline surface. The little girl looked up at the massive appendage with no fear, only curiosity. She reached out with one small hand and gently touched the creature's hide. The effect was immediate and profound. Kethra's entire body seemed to sigh, its bioluminescent patterns shifting to a warm golden glow. The creature's psychic emanations, which had been a barely noticeable whisper, suddenly bloomed into something that felt like a gentle caress against the mind. It wasn't the terrifying mental assault that had driven fleets to madness. It was something infinitely more subtle and beautiful. For the first time in 3 centuries, the galaxy's most feared weapon was truly at peace. And somehow, a small, mute child had become the key to unlocking whatever remained of its original, gentle nature. As the days passed, the bond between Sora and Kethra grew stronger. The creature would shift its position slightly each day, always, careful to keep the child within sight. When Sora wasn't there, its bio readings would spike, with what could only be described as loneliness. When she returned, the massive form would settle contentedly, its ancient eyes following her movements with something that looked remarkably like affection. The other colonists were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't just a monster hiding its time, it's a tortured soul finding peace through the innocent compassion of a child. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was the first step toward healing wounds that had festered for centuries. The silence of Haven's Rest was shattered by the roar of fusion engines as the Coalition fleet dropped out of hyperspace. Dozens of warships materialized in the planet's orbit, their hulls bristling with weapons designed specifically to penetrate Kethra's defenses. These weren't the same ships that had faced the creature 3 weeks ago. These were new vessels, built with one purpose in mind: to kill the galaxy's most feared weapon, Admiral. Lee Taman stood on the bridge of his flagship, the final justice, his weathered face set in grim determination. The fleet's encounter with Kethra had haunted him every night since. He had lost too many good people to that monster, and now he had been given the resources to finish what they had started. "Sir, we're detecting the target on the planet's surface," reported Lieutenant Park to Han, her fingers dancing across the tactical display. "It's in some kind of crater, approximately 20 kilometers from the research station." "Life signs at the station?" Taman asked, though he already knew the answer. "Confirmed, sir. 7 humans, including 1 child. They appear to be still there." Tadash Min closed his eyes for a moment. He had hoped the colonists would have evacuated by now, but some people were too stubborn for their own good. "Open a channel to the surface." The communication system crackled to life, and Taman's voice boomed across Haven's Rest. "All colonists, this is Admiral Lee Taman of the Coalition Defense Force. Evacuate immediately. We are commencing bombardment in 30 minutes. Repeat, you have 30 minutes to clear the area." In the research station, Dr. Kim Hae-jin felt her blood turn to ice. She had been expecting this moment, but she hadn't thought it would come so soon. Around her, the other colonists scrambled to gather their belongings, their faces pale with fear. "Mama, we have to help it," Sora said, tugging at her mother's sleeve. The child's eyes were wide with urgency, and she pointed toward the crater, where Kethra lay resting. "No, sweetheart," Hae-jin said, grabbing her daughter's hand. "We have to leave. The ships are here to destroy the creature. It's not safe." But Sora pulled away with surprising strength, her small form darting toward the station's exit. She had spent weeks sitting with Kethra, forming a connection that no one else could understand. She couldn't abandon her friend now. "Sora, no," Jin cried, chasing after her daughter. The child ran across the barren ground, toward the crater, her bare feet kicking up small clouds of dust. Behind her, she could hear her mother's frantic calls, but she didn't slow down. Kethra was in danger, and she was the only one who could help. In the crater, the massive creature's biopatterns had changed dramatically. The peaceful blue glow that had emanated from its hide for weeks was now spiking with agitation. Kethra could sense the approaching threat, dozens of ships filled with hostile intent, their weapons trained on its resting place. Every instinct that had been programmed into it over the centuries screamed for it to rise and fight, but something held it back. The presence of the small human child, the one who had sat with it day after day, created a conflict in its ancient mind. Its conditioning demanded violence, but the peaceful connection it had formed with Sora whispered of another way. The first coalition ships moved into position overhead, their massive forms blotting out the sun. These weren't the same vessels that had faced Kethra before. They were newer, deadlier, designed specifically to exploit every weakness the creature had shown in previous battles. Captain Yoon Soo-jin, commanding the destroyer Retribution, checked her weapon systems one final time, plasma cannons charged and ready, new penetrator missiles loaded, biodisruptor beams online. "Target the creature's central nervous system," Taman ordered from the flagship. "We end this quickly and cleanly." Down in the crater, Kethra's massive form began to stir. Its crystalline hide brightened with defensive patterns, and its tentacles started to writhe with increasing agitation. The creature's psychic emanations, which had been so gentle for weeks, began to spike with the old familiar aggression. But then Sora reached the crater's edge. The child stood at the rim of the impact site, a small form dwarfed by the massive creature below. Kethra's alien gaze fixed on her, and for a moment, the creature seemed to hesitate. The defensive patterns on its hide flickered, caught between the ancient programming that demanded violence and the newer, gentler impulses that the child had. Awakened, Sora walked forward, her bare feet crunching on the debris-strewn ground. Pieces of crystalline bioarmor lay scattered around the crater's edge, still warm from the creature's body heat. She had touched these fragments many times over. The past weeks, feeling the strange connection that flowed between them. "Sora, get away from there," Jin screamed, reaching the crater's edge just as her daughter approached the creature. But Sora didn't stop. She reached out with one small hand and placed it against a section of Kethra's hide that had fallen. Within reach, the moment her palm made contact, both child and creature went perfectly still. The connection that had been building for weeks. It suddenly exploded into full awareness. Sora's mind touched Kethra's, and she saw everything: the pain, the loneliness, the centuries of forced violence that had shaped the creature into a weapon. She felt the weight of countless deaths, the agony of a gentle soul twisted into something monstrous. But deeper still, buried beneath layers of conditioning and programming, she sensed something else. A single word locked away in the creature's mind like a key in a forgotten drawer. The word that the Zephyrians had implanted as a failsafe. The command that could override all other programming above them. The coalition ships powered their weapons. Targeting systems locked onto Kethra's vital points. An energy reading spiked as the fleet prepared to unleash enough firepower to crack a moon. Final targeting solution confirmed, Park Dahan reported. "It all ships ready to fire on your command." "Sir?" Tameen raised his hand, ready to give the order that would end the creature's reign of terror once and for all. But something made him pause. Down in the crater, the small human child was still touching the creature, and both of them were completely motionless. "Sir?" Park Dahan asked, her finger hovering over the firing control. In the crater, Sora lifted her head. Her young face was wet with tears, not of fear, but of overwhelming sadness for the tortured soul she had touched. The word that had been locked away in Kethra's mind now echoed in her own thoughts, clear as crystal, for the first time in her 8 years of life. Sora spoke. Her voice carried across the crater, clear and strong despite her youth. But she didn't speak in Korean or Standard Galactic. The word that emerged from her lips was in the ancient Zephyrian tongue, a language that had been dead for centuries, but that somehow she knew: Shalim. The word meant sleep in the old language, but its deeper meaning was far more profound. In the context of the Zephyrian bioweapons, it meant be free. It was the release command, the key that would unlock the chains that had bound Kethra for 3 centuries. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. The word rippled through Kethra's consciousness like a shockwave, shattering the mental barriers that had held its true nature prisoner. Layers of conditioning began to peel away, revealing the gentle soul that had been buried beneath centuries of enforced violence. The creature's massive form shuddered. Its bioluminescent patterns shifted from aggressive red to something softer, more natural. The psychic emanations that had once driven fleets to madness transformed into something beautiful, a song of peace that touched every mind on the planet. On the flagship, Admiral Taman staggered as the wave of mental energy washed over him. But instead of the terror and madness that Kethra had always brought, he felt something else entirely: peace, understanding, and most shocking of all, forgiveness. Sir Park Dahan whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "The creature's hostile. Signatures are gone. It's not a weapon anymore." In the crater, Kethra's massive head turned toward Sora with infinite gentleness. The child's single word had done what 3 centuries of violence could not. It had set the creature free. And in that moment of liberation, the galaxy's most feared weapon chose to become something else entirely. The little girl who had been mute for 8 years had finally found her voice. And with it, she had spoken the word that changed everything. Ancient Zephyrian command rippled through Kethra's consciousness like a tsunami of liberation. For the first time in 3 centuries, the creature experienced something it had forgotten existed: choice. The mental chains that had bound it to endless violence shattered one by one, each broken link releasing memories that had been buried for lifetimes. The clarity that flooded its mind was so overwhelming, it was almost painful. Like suddenly seeing sunlight after centuries of darkness, Admiral Lee Taman stood frozen on the bridge of his flagship. Watching the impossible unfold below, he had come here expecting the final battle against the galaxy's most feared weapon. Instead, he was witnessing something that defied every military manual ever written. Kethra's massive form was changing before his eyes, not into a more dangerous configuration, but into something entirely different. The aggressive spines that had adorned the creature's back for centuries began to retract, sinking back into its crystalline hide like weapons being sheathed. Its bioluminescent patterns, which had pulsed with threatening red for as long as anyone could remember, shifted to a gentle blue that reminded observers of peaceful ocean depths. Most remarkably, its psychic emanations, the mental assault, that had driven entire fleets to madness, transformed into something that felt like a warm embrace. Sir Lieutenant Park Dahayan reported, her voice filled with wonder as she stared at her instrument readings. The creature's hostile signatures are completely gone. All weapon systems appear to be powering down. It's not a weapon anymore. Captain Yoon Sujen's voice crackled over the communication system from the destroyer Retribution. Admiral, my crew is reporting something impossible. The fear we always felt around this thing, it's gone. Instead, they're saying they feel ... protected. Down in the crater, Dr. Kim Hyjin reached her daughter's side just as Kethra lowered its enormous head toward the child. The movement was slow and deliberate, filled with a gentleness that seemed impossible from something so massive. The creature's ancient eyes, each one larger than a human torso, focused on Sora with an intelligence that was clearly benevolent. Sora placed both small hands against the creature's crystalline surface, and her face lit up with understanding. When she spoke again, her voice was soft but clear, carrying across the crater with surprising strength for someone who had been mute her entire life. It was never angry, she said, her words translating emotions that flowed between her and the creature like a river of shared consciousness. It was just ... trapped and lonely.
So very lonely.
The child's simple words carried more truth than 1,000 scientific reports. Through their connection, Sora could feel the creature's true nature, not the violent destroyer the galaxy feared, but a being of profound gentleness that had been forced to become something monstrous. The pain of those lost centuries flowed between them, but so did something else. Hope Admiral Taman found himself lowering his hand, the order to fire dying on his lips. Around him, his crew watched in stunned silence as the creature they had come to destroy revealed its true nature. The Coalition fleet held its fire, their weapon systems powering down as the truth became undeniable. Kethra had chosen to abandon its role as destroyer. The creature's transformation continued throughout the day. Its massive form settled deeper into the crater, no longer preparing for battle but taking on the aspect of a living mountain. Its biosystems began to shift and adapt, growing root-like extensions that burrowed into the planet's surface. Instead of drawing energy from conquest and destruction, it was now seeking sustenance from the soil itself. It's incredible, Doctor, Park Ji-woo whispered, his bioscanner recording readings that would revolutionize xenobiology. The creature is literally rooting itself to the planet. It's becoming part of Haven's Rest's ecosystem. As the weeks passed, the changes became even more dramatic. Kethra's hide, once impenetrable armor designed for war, began to soften and develop a texture that was almost bark-like. Flowers started to bloom along its massive flanks not planted there, but growing naturally from the creature's own biosystems. Small animals that had fled during the crash began to return, building nests in the folds of the creature's hide. The news of Kethra's transformation spread across the galaxy like wildfire. Governments that had spent fortunes trying to destroy the creature suddenly found themselves dealing with an entirely new reality. The weapon they had feared for 3 centuries had become something unprecedented, a guardian. Months later, Haven's Rest became a pilgrimage site for beings from across the galaxy. Ships arrived daily, carrying diplomats, scientists, pilgrims, and curious travelers who came to see the great creature that had chosen peace over war. They came to witness the miracle of Sora, the small girl who had whispered the word that changed everything. The research station was expanded into a proper facility to accommodate the visitors. Dr. Kim Hyjin found herself thrust into the role of chief researcher for what became known as the Havens. Rest project a scientific endeavor to understand how Kethra's transformation had occurred and what it meant for the future. But the most remarkable changes were in Sora herself. The child who had been mute for 8 years was now the voice for one of the galaxy's most important beings. Each evening, she would sit beside Kethra's massive form, her small voice growing stronger as she learned to translate between human language and the creature's complex emotional communications. Kethra wants everyone to know that the old violence is over. She would tell the gathered scientists and diplomats. It remembers everything it did, and it's sorry. But it can't change. The past it can only try to protect the future. The creature's new role as guardian manifested in ways that amazed observers. When severe storms threatened the planet, Kethra would use its psychic abilities to calm the weather patterns. When dangerous radiation from solar flares approached, it would generate protective energy fields. Most remarkably, it could sense threats to the planet from across the star system, alerting the colonists to dangers long before they arrived. Admiral Taman, who had once come to destroy the creature, became one of its most vocal supporters. He established a permanent coalition presence on Haven's Rest, not as an occupying force, but as protectors of what he called the galaxy's greatest treasure. "I came here to kill a monster," he told the Galactic Council during his famous testimony. "Instead, I found hope. If a creature programmed for 3 centuries of violence can choose peace, then maybe there's hope for all of us." The Zephyrian Empire had created Cathora to be the ultimate weapon, but in their arrogance, they had built it too well. They had given it the capacity for choice, never imagining that it might one day choose differently. The failsafe they had installed to control their weapon had instead become the key to its freedom. As the sun set over Haven's Rest, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Kethra's massive form stood silhouetted against the stars. Its bioluminescent patterns pulsed gently, creating a light show that could be seen from orbit. Beside it, small but unafraid, sat Sora the child, whose first word had been the most important ever spoken. Visitors often asked Sora what Kethra was thinking as it watched the stars each night. The girl would smile and place her hand on the creature's warm hide, listening to thoughts that flowed like music. "It's dreaming," she would say. "Dreaming of all the worlds it wants to protect and all the people it wants to keep safe. It's not looking back anymore, it's looking forward." The galaxy's most feared weapon had become its most devoted guardian, proving that sometimes the mightiest hearts can indeed be moved by the gentlest touch. And in the quiet moments when the stars shone brightest, both the ancient creature and the young girl knew that this was only the beginning of their story together. The age of Kethra, the destroyer, was over. The age of Kethra, the guardian, had begun. The end.